In the next few Breakfast Bible Bites, we will back up in Scriptures to Psalm 44, beginning in verse 2. It reads, "You with your own hand drove out the nations, then you planted them. You afflicted the peoples, then you spread them abroad." David probably recalls the bedtime narratives of his father Jesse as he was told about how God drove out the mighty Canaanites from the land some 500 years earlier, land that God had promised to Abraham. Compared to the fledgling Israelites, the Canaanites were a populace that was to be fearfully contended with, warlike and courageous, firmly established and fortified in the land which God was about to commandeer and extricate them from. God, who sets up the boundaries of nations, had not deeded the land to them. It was reserved for Abraham's offspring. While they resisted, they were no match for God and his far feebler newborn nation. God afflicted the trespassing interlopers with nature's weapons to disseminate and dishearten and disperse them, thus allowing Joshua easy and almost flawless victories. In the cities that were formerly occupied by the heathens, the tribes of Israel were then firmly ensconced and established. The might and power of God to establish boundaries and nations should be taught as deeds, both of mercy and justice. Both need to be called to mind, to both the Jews and the Christians alike, in such tremulous times so as to build up their strength, the strength of our fragile yet wavering faith. When I think of God's establishing Israel in the Promised Land, my thoughts go to the pilgrim story of our own nation. Had God not been involved in the affairs of men some 15 years before the Mayflower landed near Plymouth Rock, the colony of God-fearing Christians could not have been established. God began around 1592 by preparing an Indian boy by the name of Squanto. While on his way back to his Patuxent tribal lands in 1605, Squanto and others were kidnapped by an English lieutenant, Thomas Hunt. Hunt was planning to sell the captured natives into slavery in Spain for about 20 pounds apiece. Some local friars discovered what Hunt was attempting and purchased the remaining Native Americans with the goal of teaching them English and instructing them in the Christian faith. At some point in time, Squanto convinced the friars to let him try to return home. Managing to get to London, he lived and worked with a shipbuilder by the name of John Slaney for a few years. Slaney's influence had apparently increased Squanto's English vocabulary, so he chose to take Squanto with him when he sailed to Cooper's Cove in Newfoundland. Here, Squanto tried to take part in an expedition to the North American East Coast. However, God was in charge of the timing and had better plans for Squanto. So when that plan fell through, Squanto, in 1618, he returned to England. At last, in 1619, Squanto was able to return to his homeland aboard John Smith's ship, having joined an exploratory expedition along the New England coast, led by Captain Thomas Dermer. He soon discovered the Patuxents, as well as the majority of the coastal New England tribes, mostly the Wampanoags and of Massachusetts, had been killed off the year prior by an epidemic plague, quite possibly smallpox, since Indians had no natural immunity to the European infectious disease. When the Pilgrims landed in an area formerly inhabited by the Patuxent, they discovered a stash of corn, maize, and cleared fields, but they were lacking the essential knowledge on how to plant this nutrient-demanding maize. Faced with starvation and certain death, the English-speaking Indian that God had prepared for the event, Squanto, helped these unskilled wilderness pilgrim farmers to recover from an extremely harsh first winter by teaching them how to cultivate the maize using a seasonal fish called alewives, and how to capture the slippery migrating eels and menhaden for food to sustain them. Was all of this just a coincidence, or was God really involved in the establishment of America as a light into the heathen nations? Today, some take offense at the European migrants' displacement of the Indian tribes and perhaps much of it was driven by greed and a lack of godly love that precipitated their undermining. But God had greater plans for this new land. He ordained it as a light for the world while Israel was in diaspora and out of the land, deeded as their homeland.